This is Synchronicity.
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 Welcome to Synchronicity. My guest this week, that's right, I have a guest. Greg Marcus wrote a book about American Mussar. You will hear all about that in this episode. You do not want to miss it if you're struggling with any internal issues, if life is not playing cooperation with you, if you're noticing yourself getting unhinged or upset or impatient or greedy or selfish, all of these things, this is a really good episode to listen to. And of course, I'm saying this facetiously because who isn't dealing with those issues on a regular basis? I don't know those people, do you? But this episode is going to be a real treat for you. And it's also, right, before the episode is nothing to do with cryptocurrency at all. Speaking of crypto, did someone mention cryptocurrency? Did someone mention it? Oh, that was me. I want to let you know very quickly about something that's going on in this Discord server I have started. So here's the deal. It started as a free server. We have well over 100 people in there now. We are really helping people out. People are making money. They're having a good time. They're learning. They're understanding. They're getting less afraid. They're getting more certain. And the doubt is being erased. We're upsetting the economic paradigm. We are helping each other out, and it's really fun. Now, here's the thing that's going on. Right now, I'm recording this. It's the middle of January, early January. Starting in February, this server becomes a paid server, meaning if you want to get in, it costs money just to be in there. Why does it cost money? Because we're doing free voice chats. We're doing signal alerts, when to buy things, when to sell things. We're doing oracles. We have signals coming out about very specific events and things you might want to look at. We have coin-specific research. We have independent, fundamental, and technical analysis and marketplace dynamics research that you're not going to find even on other paid servers, because we have personally and collectively done really fucking well over the past month and a half. There's no other way to say that. So if you're interested in, get in now. For the entire month of January, if you join the Discord server, there will be a link on this episode page. There will be a link on this podcast. If you join, you're grandfathered in, meaning you will have access to the premium server forever until I change my mind. I'm just kidding. If you're in the gates for good. You'll be one of the early founding members and you don't have to pay. Starting in February, you want to know how much it's going to cost? I'll let you know. It's going to cost 0.03 Bitcoin per month or 0.13 Bitcoin a year. So if you want to go look at the exchange rates and see how expensive that is and realize, holy shit, has no one lost his mind? He's charging a lot of money to get in there. No, I haven't lost my mind. That's probably too good of a deal. We'll see how the price goes. So get in there now. It's free. You're getting this deal because you listen to this podcast and hopefully you've been listening for a long time. And I really appreciate that. And I want to send some of the love back. Speaking of love, thank you to everyone who contributes on Patreon. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be linking that with Discord in some interesting ways coming up too. So stay tuned for that. Patrick Nemchik, you're the man. I usually mention him on the end of the episodes, but I'm going to mention him up front. You're the best. Okay, let's get to this episode. American Mussar. What is this? So Greg Marcus, who's today's guest, has been working on this for about 8 years, I believe, if my memory is correct. And it's essentially a Judaic practice of mindfulness. But before we really even knew what mindfulness was, and especially before the buzzword was coming around, and it's how to investigate your own internal, what he refers to, and they refer to as soul traits. There's 13 of them. And try to figure out where the imbalances may be based on your perception of yourself and the world around you. What I like about it is something that honors the divine and magical aspects of reality, but is also a very practical, down-to-earth thing. And that's kind of what we like to focus on this podcast. So it hits those, It checks those boxes. So I don't want to babble on any much more. This is what happens. My sentences start to break down when I've been talking too much. You're going to like this episode. There are more guests coming up. Don't worry. I've got, in case you haven't figured it out, there's a lot of shit going on in my life, but I will make this promise that I will continue to do this podcast through all of this. I'm also going to be upgrading the podcast. Don't worry. New music is coming for all my Patreon babies. Don't worry. It's coming. I'm working on it. It's coming. Just trust me. Let me do what I got to do for a couple months. It's going to work out. Trust me on that. Okay. That's it. Oh boy. It's been quite the week. Without further ado, here is Greg Marcus. Thank you so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure to be here.
So I think a great place to start is, can you tell me, and I don't want to butcher the word, Mussar? Is it Mussar?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
American Mussar. Tell me a little bit. Assume I know nothing. I know something. I've done some reading, but assume I know nothing about what this is. How would you describe what American Mussar is?
Right. So Mussar is a 1,000-year-old Jewish spiritual practice that teaches us how to find those things inside that cause us to get stuck in the same situation again and again. And it offers a path towards balance and healing through mindful living. So really, like, some people look at it and they say, oh, so the Jews invented cognitive behavioral therapy 1,000 years ago. And it does have a lot of similarities to that, but it's very firmly grounded within the Jewish tradition. So like in traditional Judaism, you're supposed to learn like the holy books like the Torah, and those present guidelines for how to live your life.
Right.
Well, Mussar is like an experiential way of doing that. Rather than kind of memorizing all these laws and rules, it says, how do we develop our character? How do we become the kind of person who just intuitively, in our bones, know how to react and be present and be a good person, to be a mensch, an outstanding person, a person of outstanding character, whatever life throws at us.
It sounds a little bit kind of like the tantric path from our Eastern friends in terms of going into the world to try to understand what's happening rather than just conceptually taking kind of aphorisms or axioms and applying them to your life. I really like that, because we were just talking about what would my audience enjoy. It's like practical things that would help them. So where did it come from? Where did it originate? I'm Jewish, so I have some familiarity with the Torah and the Zohar and some of the more mystical aspects, but where did this kind of emerge or originate from?
Right. So there are elements of the Mussar tradition that go way, way back. I mean, there are stories in the Talmud, which is a commentary on the Torah, which says, Rabbi so-and-so was so pious that he would never, this is actually a really funny story, he would never urinate within 10 feet of where people were sleeping. So, which kind of tells you a little bit about which kind of tells you about what life was like back then. Like, right. Obviously, if that was like a story of pious behavior, then no one would think twice about doing that.
Yeah.
It's like, so I think like my own personal, so I look at that story and I say, well, how would that apply to me? I'm like, for me, my story is, if I'm going first in a buffet, I never fill my plate. Because I don't want to like pig out on the salmon or the lox and then not have some for somebody else at the end of the lot. So that's like,
I love that. So I know something I was reading on your website talked about, the true meaning of being Jewish is, kindness and compassion and helping others, which to me, whether that's Judaism or any other thing, that's what my religion and life philosophy is. It's specifically why I think a lot of us incarnate here, is to learn and experience those lessons for ourselves, and both the good and the bad. So what, I guess I've never heard Judaism actually described that way. I was bar mitzvahed, I was confirmed even, I done some reading on my own, I've actually never heard it put so simply. How do you get to that kind of succinct description of what Judaism is, or being Jewish is?
Right. Well, I think like where Judaism is today in this country, that's like a whole other topic.
Yeah.
This is like the best kept secret about Judaism. There's really a lot of cool stuff in this religion which you would never come across. But there's this story, like I'm sure you've heard of Hillel, like every college campus has a Hillel. So those are named after a famous rabbi, Rabbi Hillel. And he was asked, there's a story in the Talmud where someone came to him and says, look, if you can describe Judaism while standing on one foot, then I'll convert. And so he said, that which is hateful to you, don't do to another. The rest is just commentary. And so that is, and there was another teaching by Rabbi Akiva which said something similar. It's like the whole of Torah is summarized in love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
So these teachings are out there, but it gets lost in the noise of the detail.
I was going to say, I get it, because that's the golden rule, another really good one. But Judaism has made such a religion out of commentary and analysis, and it's built into the core of it, which I think is actually a great thing. You shouldn't just blindly be doing what something in a book says. So the commentary is useful, but the perils of that is it can get overly intellectualized and analyzed to a point where you do kind of forget that core message is like, don't be a jerk. I mean, Jesus was saying the same thing. It's not too different.
No, it's not different at all. And so going back to your earlier question about where Mussar came from, there's been these threads within Judaism about, and there's Mussar's really cool because it's kind of this countercultural thread which keeps appearing within Judaism, where there's the main line, which is there's all this commentary, there's all this rules, there's all this intellectualizing, and then there's this, but you got to be kind, you got to be a good person. It's not enough to memorize the 10 levels of charity. That doesn't make you a giving person.
Right.
You actually need to do this. So the first books about this appeared about 1,000 years ago. Like the first one was called Duties of the Heart, which was written in the 11th century in Spain. It was actually written in Judeo-Arabic. So it was like kind of in this golden age where the Muslims and the Jews were living together in this beautiful poetry and coexistence in Spain of the time. And in the introduction, he said, some people become rabbis because it gives them a lot of status and juice in the community. And they'll spend 25 years memorizing all these laws, but they'll never once work on their own character.
Right.
And I want a book to say, well, how do we become this person? It's like, it's great to say, yeah, I want to be kind and generous. But the trick is, what is holding me back from doing that? In the real world, I have some dark things inside, or I have some things which I think I'm doing the right thing, but I'm actually rationalizing, and I'm not, and I'm being selfish. And so the question is, well, what is really going on? What's happening in this internal world? Which is, like all the commandments are there, but we have a really hard time following them. I mean, I can't hardly go a day without screwing up in some way.
A day, like an hour. Are you kidding me? Like, it's not. I wish it was a day. I love that you brought up dealing with the dark stuff. Two things about that. One, I'm a huge Carl Jung fan. Identifying with archetypal patterns and energies, and your shadow side is critical to understanding, his kind of conception of the collective unconscious. But I was just talking last night to my dad about this, which is, you have to deal with your dark side stuff. If you don't, when you actually get into a position of actually having some sway or influence or power, you're going to be overwhelmed by these things that you haven't dealt with. And I think that's, that says a lot to kind of where we are in the world today, is a lot of people who have risen to the tops of our power structure world haven't dealt with their shadow sides, and it consumes and it dominates, and it's not comfortable for people either. Like, we look at someone, just to take the caricature example, like Donald Trump, that's not a happy man, like that. There's nothing about him where someone's looking at him saying that guy seems really satisfied and happy about everything in life. They may think whatever your opinion of it is, I don't think that's what's coming out. So I love that you bring up dealing with kind of these sticky internal dark situations or potentially dark situations. What are some of the approaches that Mussar offers people in terms of actually, being mindful about what's going on inside? What are some of the techniques or approaches that provide some, insight into that? Or yeah.
Right. So one of the things I articulated for American Mussar, which is kind of my 21st century take on Mussar, which is to try to bring it to a much wider audience. You don't need to go to a yeshiva. You don't need to know Hebrew. And so I create these assumptions, which kind of gives you the backstory. And one of the assumptions is that we're driven by this conflict between the good inclination and the evil inclination. And the evil inclination, it's not like the Voldemort evil. It's not like the Al-Qaeda ISIS evil. It's what Freud would call the id, or it's these shadow things. It's our sexual drives, our anger, our selfishness. And all of those happen to map to the amygdala. And then the good inclination, it's our compassion, it's our social impulses, it's our wanting to connect and to be with others. And those all happen to map to the prefrontal cortex. And if you look at the brain, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex actually are in conflict with each other. And if you drink alcohol, it's right?
Yeah.
It's so it's understanding that if we're not conscious, we're just going to automatically kind of float through life. And we might do the right thing by habit. We might do the wrong thing by habit. And what a Mussar approach does is it helps us recognize that we have choices. It helps crystallize around choice points, which are these times when it could go either way. I could do the right thing. I might not do the right thing. And it's more and more often bringing that into focus. So let me pause there because that's not at the practical level yet, but I think it's an important part of the backstory.
Absolutely.
You tracking with me so far?
I am, and I'm seeing your lovely kitty, who reminds me of my lovely kitty who lives with my mom now, who my cat's name was Isis, which the name has been ruined, but that is a beautiful kitty.
This is Finn, and he has a brother named Huck.
Love it. So I love that you brought up kind of these choice points and these kind of, let me ask you this. Where does this is a conversation that I've copped to this. Oftentimes when I ask questions, I have an opinion that I'm waiting to hear what the other person says. Go figure. Right. But on this next question I'm going to ask, I haven't settled on my belief structure. Where does the concept of...
I'm feeling the pressure now.
Oh yeah, feel the pressure. Feel the burn. Yeah. Where does the concept of free will and like destiny and fate fit into these choice points when, you're identifying these internal things where you have basically, you take this one or the past. So maybe it's not a direct conflict of the good wolf and the bad wolf, but there is some decision that needs to be made. How does free will kind of fit into this picture for you?
Oh, I love that. So that's another one of the assumptions. And that's that we all have free will, but it's not always accessible. So, I, a year ago, started doing Mussar parenting because I have two teenagers. I know you have a young son, so you're not quite there yet. But with these two teen daughters, I'm like, I need some help because I'm, like, trying to do this practice, trying to be a good person, but like stuff is coming out of my mouth and I'm getting pissed off and things are coming out of my mouth, which in theory I had free will, but they were out of my mouth before I could say them. And so what Mussar does is what Rabbi Pear calls creating some additional space between the match and the fuse. It's almost like creating a muscle memory for how we act or how we show up or how we view the situation, which really gives us a different level of choices. Can I share an example, or did you want to ask?
No, please share. You have free reign to speak as long and about whatever you want. Don't take my constant chattering as anything other than me just having that habit.
Okay. So once when the kids were younger, so one more piece about how Mussar works, and then I'll share this example. So what we do is we focus on a particular soul trait for usually 2 weeks at a time. So these are things like patience, humility, trust, honor. And the idea is that having too much of one of these soul traits is just as bad as having not enough. So if we have too little patience, we're angry and frustrated all the time. If we have too much patience, maybe we're staying in a bad job, we're staying in a bad relationship, or not taking action. And so we'll start the day with like a little mantra for our meditation for 2 minutes to help frame the day, which psychologist tells us when we frame our day, then all of a sudden throughout the day, we're noticing when our patience is being challenged. And then we write down at night how we responded. Maybe we met the challenge positively, maybe we didn't. But either way, in a non-judgmental way, we write it down. And each time, and then we pick one area where we're going to try to act. We're not going to boil the ocean. We're not going to, I'm not suddenly going to become the Dalai Lama and be ultra patient. I'm just trying to become a little bit more patient. Okay, so you with me so far?
I'm so with you.
Okay. All right, so here I was. This was maybe 5-ish years ago, and was trying to get the kids out to school in the morning. And being young kids, they're farting around, they're not putting their shoes on. And I used to get really pissed off because I had places to go and things to do. And I was working on patience, and suddenly I kind of envisioned them as these two little divine sparks. And they were and my whole attitude just changed, and all of my anger and frustration just melted away. And I saw them as, young kids who were just kind of having fun and interacting with the world. And so rather than yelling at them to put their shoes on, I just started interacting and joking with them. And, you can't get them out the door any faster. You really can't, because if you start yelling at them.
Oh, I think you're covering your mic.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Sorry. So you really can't get them out the door any faster, by yelling at them. They start crying and what have you. So anyway, it just changed who I was, and it gave me a different choice. And by making that different choice and showing up differently, they were happier, I was happier, and we got out the door in the same amount of time.
It's interesting. There's two things that popped up in my brain when you were saying that. We'll call it the mind. One is this idea of too much of any one good quality in air quotes can actually turn into a bad thing. Reminds me of kind of a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, which is every negative perceived, so anger, we're going to say, is negative. Actually, in its purified form, it's just a kind of more obscured, purified quality, which in anger, for instance, it would be awareness or attention. I have awareness that I need to get somewhere. And then your reaction to that is, the thing where we take our own karma and do what we want with it. The other thing that was very interesting when you were talking that popped up in my head is I used to be very much into neuro-linguistic programming, which I have not really, investigated too much in the past 10 years. But this idea of framing is something they're very big on. You can actually, do a lot of very interesting things with neuro-linguistic programming if you, frame certain things in a different way. And this idea of this early morning mantra, framing your day, again, so many of these things seem just like mindfulness and meditation, or even, Vedic mantras. I don't find it surprising because I fundamentally believe this is all talking about the same stuff. The one question that first popped up in my head, though, for you was 13 soul traits. I would love to hear what they are. You named some of them. Why 13? 13 is my favorite number. That's why I ask.
Oh, okay. So there are 13 that I cover in the book.
Right.
And 13 is often a number that people use. So the short answer is, if you cycle through 13 soul traits and you spend 2 weeks on each one, when you finish the 13th, you go back to the first, you spend another 2 weeks on each one. That is 52 weeks.
Right.
So in the course of a year, you spent 4 weeks on each soul trait.
Right.
Now, the origin of that, believe it or not, is Benjamin Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, he talked about these 13 virtues, and he would have a little phrase he recited in the morning, and he had a little checkbox he would do at night, And each week he would focus on one and he would cycle through. So how does this end up in the Mussar world?
Yeah.
Franklin's autobiography somehow made it to the Ukraine and was read by a rabbi whose name was Menachem Mendeleev. And he wrote a book that was called Heshbon HaNefesh, which was a counting of the soul, about 13 soul traits. And you did this practice and these mantras. He doesn't cite Benjamin Franklin, but they're almost exactly the same soul traits. It's almost exactly the same. So in his letters, he talks about Franklin and says, oh, I read this American and he had this great, he was a very virtuous Gentile. And so why didn't he talk about him? Because the other Jews wouldn't have listened to a Gentile's way of doing things. The same craziness that we sometimes see today existed back then as well. So it's now many modern Mussar practitioners do these sorts of practices, which go back to Benjamin Franklin.
That's super interesting. And obviously I never would have ever been able to figure that out. And it makes sense that they would have obscured, the rabbi would have obscured where the origins was, because that is something that unfortunately persists, not obviously just in Judaism, in many religions and traditions, where if it comes from somewhere else, you're not going to listen to that. That's not our thing. How could we?
Right.
Which probably, I imagine, is at odds with the practice of Mussar, which is probably not an exclusionary, they're not like us, so don't help them. I just can't imagine that's made it in there.
Right. Well, I mean, it depends. If you're kind of in the Orthodox world of Judaism, then it's and there are certain Mussar organizations and institutions which it has to be like not only from a Jewish source, but from a Mussar source. If you're from the liberal branch of Judaism, then we'll from just about anybody except Jesus.
Yeah.
That's kind of so yeah, I don't know. I don't personally have a lot of patience for that. There's wisdom to be found everywhere.
Yes, I think that for those of us who have done some comparative analysis when it comes to wisdom traditions or just religions or whatever it is, it gets harder and harder to deny the fact that there are core principles that are underneath all of them. And so if you get to the point where you want to start excluding some things, you create this schism in your mind, in your psyche, which I think eventually has to be addressed if you're trying to, come up with a clear perspective of everything that's going on. So it's almost like I agree. I wouldn't describe myself as not having patience for it. I clearly understand and can empathize with people who feel that way, but I don't, it's like, someone telling me that, the sky is falling, the sky is absolutely falling. The sun is not going to come up tomorrow. I respect your opinion, but I'm not going to take the time to buy into that as a reality that I live in. So I totally get that. Let me ask you this. How did you get into this? How long have you been studying or, interested in Mussar?
So I have been practicing and facilitating Mussar for about 6 years. So I'm a bit of a serial reinventor. So I started as a scientist and then I became a marketer, and I was a workaholic and ended up writing a book kind of describing how I got out of my workaholism. And the method I used was small, gradual changes, kind of inspired by values. So when I learned about Mussar in a family education program, I really resonated with it. Because at this point, I'd already written my first book, and it was all about these small, gradual, incremental changes. And I loved it. And so for 2 years, I thought about it. Finally went to the rabbi, and I said, I really want to teach Mussar here. And she said, great. And I said, and I need to learn Mussar first. And she said, okay, fantastic. And so she paid for me to take this online Mussar class. And I just read everything I could get my hands on. And 2 months later, I had created my own class called Work-Life Balance through Mussar. And it was supposed to be, myself and like 6 or 7 other people that I knew, and we were going to meet 5 times. And then after 5, it's like, this is fantastic. Let's keep going. So then we met 5 more, and we met 5 more. And suddenly, after 3 years, I had this body of teachings that I was using, and that's what I used to turn into the book.
It's so cool, and I'm sure you can appreciate the feeling that when you're doing something with not the specific intention of having it be a big ambitious project. And if you're a reinventor, we're used to getting into those mindsets, but when something just organically kind of snowballs and grows into this thing, and then you see that that thing is helping people, it's hard to find better feelings in life than that. Maybe hugging your kids, that's pretty good too, but that's to me what life is about. Were you interested in other philosophies or wisdom things before getting into Mussar? Like, did anything pique your interest?
Yeah, I was in the corporate world, and I thought I was living like my dream life. I was getting promoted, things were going great, I was put in charge of stuff, and it all came crashing down when I became the scapegoat for a product launch that went bad. I was publicly humiliated by the president of the company. I had at the biggest meeting in my field of the year, my best customer presented terrible data and my product, so I had to spend all day tap dancing and saying how everything was going to work out.
Right.
And then that night, my grandmother died.
Holy shit!
I was so wrapped up in this work stuff. I was working 90 hours a week, and I was totally frantic and wrapped up in this that I was going to skip the funeral.
Wow.
And they actually held the funeral for a day so I could, quote, finish my work and get to the funeral. Now, that's a big deal in Judaism. You don't hold funerals.
Yeah.
So this is kind of how wrapped up I was. So 2 weeks later was Yom Kippur. And that's, the holiest day of the year. Jews don't eat or drink. Many go to services. You reflect on your life. So here I was, 3 PM, feeling really woozy. They're chanting the Torah up at the front. I don't understand a word of it. And I glance down at the translation, and these words jump out at me: don't turn to idols or molten things. My first thought was really dismissive. I'm thinking, my life has fallen apart, and here we are starting in with the statues again. Nobody has done this for thousands of years. What is, can't we retire this? And then this phrase popped into my head. It was this quiet voice that said, you need to do what's best for the company. And when I heard that, my stomach clenched and my palms got sweaty. And I started thinking about, well, what is a corporation? It's this amorphous thing. And I thought about, I was in marketing. And I thought about the time that I tried to create an ad using the company logo, and everyone was really mad at me because I was profaning the logo. And it hit me that I had turned my employer into a false idol. And doing what's best for the company is not the same as what's doing best. Certainly wasn't best for me. It wasn't best for the customers. It wasn't best for anybody. And I decided that day I need to start putting people first. I need to reconnect with the values that I was raised with and put myself first and my family first. And within a year, I'd cut my hours by a third without changing jobs. And a year later, I'd cut my hours by a third again. And that was, I didn't really understand what happened at the time, and some people might look at that and it's like, okay, well, you have a moment of clarity and you're withdrawn from the world and something came into your head. But I don't believe that now. I believe that I got a message from the divine.
Yeah.
And I listened. And it wasn't guaranteed that I listened. I could have, but I listened and I made changes that day. And I'm absolutely convinced that if I hadn't, I would have had a major health issue. I might have died. I might have had a stroke. I don't know what would have happened. I might have gotten divorced. But that really set me on a spiritual path. And over time, as I've grown and learned more and accepted more, it's really changed the way that I show up and that I see the universe.
Yeah, I mean, how can it not, right? I mean, once you start delving into things that maybe we didn't grow up thinking about reality, or maybe we did when we were very young, but quickly got stamped out of us as we became
Right.
adolescents and older. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. This is the the jokingly I refer to as the blessing of the curse of being aware. It's harder to take wrong action when you know it's wrong. If you're just doing it ignorantly and habitually, it may take some time for you to figure out what's going on. But if you have a decision in front of you and you know one is not the ethical or right action to take, and you do it, good luck. That's not
Right.
going to be a fun experience for you. No matter how great you think you are at justifying things, it is not going to work. I mean, I love that you refer to it as a call, a message from the divine, because this is something that I believe, very deep inside of myself, that I think those messages are constantly around us. The omnipresent, for lack of a better word, omnipresent. These things are being communicated to us, and it's up to us to figure out how to clean kind of our earpiece or, filter to get these things through, that they do make sense to us. And the other thing that you mentioned, and I'm glad you brought it up too, like when you deny these calls, whether you want to call it the hero's call, just to put it in Campbellian language, when you deny these things, it can have serious consequences, not just from like your life's trajectory, from just like, oh, I'm doing this now, but from a health standpoint, from a relationship standpoint. These things ripple out these decisions we make, which again puts the emphasis on specifically what you're talking about with Mussar, which is how do we get to the point where we can actually identify and work with some of the things that are sticky for us. So let me bring this to I'm going to be so selfish right here. My biggest issue has been, listeners of this show know this, I can get angry. When I get frustrated, I get very angry and take very poor action, especially the closer people are to me, the relationships, the more they know how awful I can actually be when I get angry. What's some advice you could give me or someone else dealing with anger that Mussar offers in terms of how we could actually actively deal with that or investigate it?
Well, no, that is one of my big issues as well. And dealing with anger, and when I've had, people who are close to me have learned to deal with it. I've had people like professional relationships where I was working with someone, I got pissed off, and it was like, okay, that was it. Greg, we're not going to work with you anymore.
Yeah.
Which was really too bad, because once you kind of get to that, because then I'll calm down. But they're like,
exactly.
oh,
Yeah.
dude, I don't know what happened to you, but I don't want any part of that.
Yeah.
So, and then it's really painful.
Of course.
And then it's, or if, yell at my kid or get angry at my wife, and then you feel like crap afterwards.
Yeah.
So the question is, like, anger is a soul trait, but usually it's not something you can deal with head on. It is learning to, and it's not like there's a magic bullet. It's like, just say this mantra, don't get angry, just be patient,
Serenity now. Yeah.
Yeah, serenity now. That doesn't do any work, because the free will is not possible. So what you can start to do, though, is you can start to, as you work through multiple soul traits, and it's kind of like, anger is a symptom.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, what's causing your anger, for one person, it might be an imbalance. Like, there's some kind of underlying spiritual imbalance that's going on. And identifying that and working to heal that, the anger will start to become less of an issue. So for one person, it might be like an honor imbalance, which means honor is not honoring the divine, is about honoring the divine spark in other people. It's about like focusing on the needs of others. And so it might be, just not sufficiently honoring others. Or it might be a humility imbalance, which is being a little bit too self-centered. And they're kind of, honor and humility are kind of related to each other, because often we get angry when someone else is in our way. It's like, I want the world the way I want it.
Yeah.
Or an obstacle to the world being the way I want it to be. And since I cannot control you, I'm going to get pissed off at you.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this happens like very viscerally, very quickly.
Yeah.
And so we might do. So are you tracking? Am I making sense so far?
You're making an abundance of sense, my friend.
Right. So the question is, we try to find ways when we're not angry of of like I had one student who was a rageaholic driver.
Mm-hmm.
She got angry in a lot of parts of her life, but she was a rageaholic driver. And so when she was working on patience, she said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to let every car merge in front of me. Anyone who wants to merge, I'm just going to let them in. I'm going to go out of my way to let these cars in.
Yeah.
Came back to class 2 weeks later. She was a transformed person.
Wow.
She said, I am now the calmest driver in California. You know, I listen to podcasts on my drive. I'm smiling at everybody. I'm letting them in. And it started spilling over into other parts of her life. Because when we're developing our character, when we're balancing our soul traits, we're really healing that part of the soul inside. So suddenly in other parts of her life, people no longer became a barrier.
Right.
Like this car and I, we're fighting, we're competitors to get there. Now
Right.
it's like, hey, I'm going to honor this other person. I'm going to help them on their journey. And suddenly you're helping everybody on their journey.
You're blowing my mind right now because with my therapist, I often bring up the example of me not having patience or me getting irrationally upset when I drive, and my wife will testify to that pretty much forever. I've tried to actively suppress, which I know really isn't the best technique, when I feel the rage building, when someone makes a bonehead move. And most of my anger when driving, I've recognized, is more a fear-based, safety-based issue. I don't actively try to do crazy things on the road because I think I'm better than people. It's because I know how bad people can be at driving. So I put myself in this agitated, kind of anxious state. However, the reason you're blowing my mind is I've never once thought that I'm going to make the change that I'm going to let everyone do whatever they want. If they're going too slow, that's fine. If they want to get over, no big deal. But I could see how something is seemingly as simple as that, if that's your kind of launching pad, rather than trying to stop the trigger once it happens, would have a tremendous impact on not only your driving and your anger related to driving, but how that would, of course, seep into other aspects of your life. So you plucked it right out of my brain. So you inadvertently gave me like the best tip ever.
Right. Well, I'm so happy to hear that, Noah, because that's like why Mussar is so magical. Like I do one-on-one coaching with someone, and I was talking with someone yesterday and said, well, what are you want to work on? And she said, well, I want to understand why I do this. And I really want to understand. I'm like, no, we don't try to understand do things. It's like there's really nothing to understand. What you understand is you do it and it causes you suffering. So what we want to do is we want to find an action that we can take, which is going to nurture that positive aspect of ourselves.
Yeah, that to me is the practical benefit. I mean, that's what it's about. I mean, this is what we referenced at the top of the episode before we started recording. There are a lot of mystical and amazing and magical things that are happening at any given time, but if you get lost in that and can't actually have those principles or ideals, work for you and serve you in your life, what's the point? It's just like watching a movie. It's going to have the impact maybe when you're watching it, but the chances of it full sail changing your entire life afterwards probably won't be that high. It's fascinating. So I'm going to wrap it up, but I asked 3 questions at the end, and then one longer open format one. So here we go. And also, just I want to say before I get to the questions, thank you so much for introducing me to this, because I'm going to really delve in, and I encourage everyone listening, if this is piquing your interest, pick up Greg's book. Just before I get to the questions, remind people where they can purchase your book and your website and anywhere else you want someone to check out.
Sure. So my website is AmericanMussar.com. Mussar is Mussar, or you can search Greg Marcus Mussar. You'll find me there. The book is called The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, Finding Balance Through the Soul Traits of Mussar. And a little more than a year. We've gotten over 50 reviews on Amazon, 4.8 stars. It's very accessible. So you can find it at Amazon, you can find it in Barnes and Noble, many libraries carry it as well. And I want to say that there is a place for the mystical. I mean, one of the soul traits is awe. And just as Noah was saying, if you get too wrapped up in the awe, you lose touch with the everyday life.
I've been there.
and then, but when you are doing these sorts of actions like the traffic and the other stuff, you're bringing the spiritual to everyday life. It's not like it's someplace else. It's like, why not make driving a holy activity?
You touched on one of the another key concept that I like to remind myself and other people of, which there is no difference between the sacred and the mundane. We like to draw that barrier between the two. Oh, this was so amazing, and oh, I gotta go wash the dishes. But there really is no difference. It's your approach and perspective that you bring to that. When you imagined when you realized your children were divine sparks, you just shifted your entire mental and conscious state to something else, and who's to say it's not any less or more real than what we typically view reality through the lens we view it through. So I love that you pointed that out again. I have a feeling that if we kept talking for another 6 hours, we would keep pulling out these fundamental truths over and over again. So I'd love maybe at another point to have a follow-up conversation, because this has just been beyond enjoyable for me.
Oh, I would love to.
Definitely.
Off the air.
Without a doubt. We'll stay in touch. Don't worry about that. Okay. Cool. Questions. What is your favorite color?
My favorite color is blue.
Mine too. What's your favorite number?
My favorite number is 18.
Very interesting. Why 18?
18 is a holy number in Judaism.
Yes, it is.
If you take the Hebrew is an ancient language. There was no separate number, so every letter represents a number. And if you take the word for life and change it into numbers, it's 18.
Interesting. Also, gematria, I know it adds up to 9, another very mystical number. What is your favorite animal?
My favorite animal are cats, as we had a visitor today in our call.
I love cats too. So last question. What's a practical I almost said that wrong. What's a practical tip that has helped you in your life that you could share with other people listening right now?
So a practical tip I would say is, as someone who's still a recovering workaholic, I would say set a time when you're going to stop working and set it 2 hours before you need to go to sleep. So if you go to bed at 11, turn off your computer and all your devices and social media at 9 o'clock and just let yourself unwind for 2 hours. Social media might be a little harder, but work for sure. No text, no email, no nothing. Just let yourself unwind and sleep.
That's great advice. I'm dubious I will be able to follow it, at least in the short term. But it's really good advice. I could see just how powerful that would actually be. But man, I'm plugged into the vortex these days. It's hard to do, but I'm going to give it a shot. Greg, thank you so much for coming on and speaking about Mussar and just sharing your wisdom. I'm looking forward to doing this again.
Me too, Noah. This was a total blast. I love your show and love what you're doing. So thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Thank you for listening to that episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Greg's a really cool guy. Go check out his website, AmericanMussar.com. That's American. I'm going to trust you know how to spell that. Mussar, Mussar.com. His book, Mussar book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions. Go pick that up on Amazon, on his website. He also has a free soul quiz that you can take, a soul trait profile quiz. I took it. It was very interesting. Just a really nice, down-to-earth, cool guy. I'm going to be scheduling a session with him because he offered it, and just what a nice guy. So thank you for listening. A reminder, if you want to join that Discord group, the one that's going to be paid in February, find that on this podcast page. Email me, even noah@syncpodcast.com if you want in. I'll get you in there. Also, I've never really big up this, but my Twitter is becoming a more active place for some of the things related to cryptocurrency and the server that I mentioned. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, feel free. No press, no big deal. Okay, that's it. I will see you next week.